Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 14 is our next area that we're going to be studying in the book of Romans. Again, it's another little piece, but hopefully by the end of this study you'll understand why we are taking a look at such a little piece again. As a review, one of the things that we have to remember is that salvation through faith in Jesus brings us peace with God. And that's the goal. Just like Field of Dreams told us many, many years ago, it's money they have, it's peace they lack. And this is exactly what each and every single one of us are looking for. This is why you're studying the Bible today, because you're searching for that peace. All of us are out working and playing and doing all the things that we do because deep down we're seeking that peace that surpasses all understanding. And through a relationship with God, that salvation that comes to us through Jesus Christ, we find the foundation of that peace. We find the center point of that peace. And then that spills out into other parts of our lives. And this has been something that Paul has been repeating over and over again through the first 4 chapters of Romans. And we will continue to get a steady diet of this. And that salvation through faith in Jesus brings us the peace with God that we have so long desired in our lives as human beings. As we look at the passage we're going to be studying today, there are 2 terms that we want to discuss. First term is Adam. And in this passage, you'll hear Adam referred to several times. And Adam, yes, is a physical human being, a historical figure that lived in the Garden of Eden and that did commit original sin, which brought separation from God. And that is very true, and we have to remember that. But also, too, we have to understand that in Paul's writing in these verses, Adam is the representative of all of sinful humanity. In essence, when we think about it, if it wasn't Adam, it would have been Steve. If it wasn't Steve, it would have been John. It would have been somebody else. That this sinful part of our humanity is something that came out, and Adam just happened to be the first man. He just happened to be the first one who committed that sin. But if it wasn't him, it would have been someone else. So yes, Adam was a historical figure, but the purpose of these verses is not to bash Adam. The purpose of these verses is not to point our bony finger at him. The purpose of using Adam in these verses, as Paul is teaching us, is to remind us of the fact that we are all sinful. So Adam is simply a representative of sinful humanity. Also, too, in these passages, of course, we have Jesus. And Jesus is the salvation for sinful humanity. Not only the salvation for Adam, but the salvation for all of humanity. So in these verses, as we take a look at these 2 characters that will be playing a major role in these verses, we understand that there's so much more than just the historical figure that we're talking about. There's so much more than just the person that they were, but also to what they're representing in the teachings. And so we always have to remember that as we're looking at these verses, that Adam is a representative of sinful humanity and Jesus is the representative of salvation for sinful humanity. So with those 2 things as a foundation, we're going to go ahead and take a look, and we'll read down through chapter 5, verses 12 through 14. Then we'll come back, and then we'll pick it apart verse by verse. Let's listen to the word of the Lord. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. To be sure, sin was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not charged against anyone's account where there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking a command, as did Adam, who is a pattern of the one to come. Thanks be to God for the reading of that word. As you notice when you're reading over that word, if you haven't picked up on it yet, it's kind of like a long run-on sentence. Of course, there was no punctuation in Greek. This is where kind of there's this flow, this consciousness of flow that is coming from Paul that he's writing down to the church in Rome, and of course is being shared with us. And there's a lot of things that we need to unpack. You can read those verses on your own and kind of just say, what? What does that mean? And you need to take the time to go back and dig deeper. Whenever you're reading a passage of Scripture, and as you're reading it, your mind is saying, what? I don't get it. Then don't move on. Stop for there and soak on that for a little while. Do some study on that. And so you want to make sure that you pick everything up before you move on to something else, because it's kind of like mathematics. If you don't get the basics of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, then you'll never be able to successfully accomplish algebra and geometry and trigonometry because you don't have the basics. You need to have those basics. So whenever you come across something in Scripture that makes you go, huh, then you need to stop and you need to do some studying. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go back to verse 12. We're going to take a look at these verse by verse, and we're going to get a better understanding of what Paul's talking about so we can use it as a springboard into the rest of the letter. So looking at verse 12, therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. So the thing that we understand in this verse, first and foremost, is that sin entered the world through one man. Now, yes, please understand, there was a woman there too. Eve was also there. But again, don't shoot the messenger. This was written in a patriarchal world. The story of Adam and Eve came out of a patriarchal world. So even though Eve was present, Adam is the one that gets the lion's share of the blame because of the fact that he's the man. And so please understand that that's what the context we're talking about here. It's not letting Eve off the hook. It's just including Eve when you use the word Adam. It's kind of a both and because it's a patriarchal world. And so when we read this, you can very easily insert Eve into this. You can know that sin entered the world through one woman and one man. And so that's the understanding of what this passage is saying. But it just mentions Adam. So we say that the sin entered the world through one man. So let's understand what world means. World means humanity. Now, understand that when Adam and Eve committed the sin of eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden, sin entered the entire world, and that had an overarching effect on all of creation. It spilled over into the lives of animals. It spilled over into the lives of plants. It spilled over into our atmosphere. It spilled over into all of the ecosystem that is our planet. But in this passage specifically, when Paul is talking about the world, he's talking specifically about humanity. Not that sin didn't affect everything else, but specifically in these verses, he's talking about sin's effect on humanity, especially sin's effect on humanity's relationship with God. And that's important for us to remember, that Paul is focused on the relationship between humans and God. That's his topic here. Not that sin didn't have an effect on everything else. You understand that it did. But in these passages, Paul is specifically talking about the effect between man and God. So humanity and God, that's the pattern that he's looking at. That's what Paul is focusing on. But we understand that the sin brought death in the world, and the death did spill over. It wasn't just death for humans. We also understand that in the original sin that Adam and Eve committed in the Garden of Eden, death followed that sin. And we know that death followed that sin because in the passage in Genesis, we see that God killed animals to make clothes. So the animals did not sin, but Adam and Eve sinned because of where they are stationed in life, basically the understanding of being created in the image of God, and we have specific responsibilities. We have a specific call to tend, to steward, to take care of our world. Thus, when sin entered our lives, then sin entered the life of the world. And thus, these animals paid the price of death, not because of their sin, but because of Adam and Eve's sin. When Adam and Eve sinned, they realized they were naked and they hid from God. And God said, "Who told you that you were naked?" And they said that we ate the tree, we ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We ate the fruit that you told us not to eat. And because of that, God had to kill animals to make clothes for Adam and Eve to wear. So yes, remember that sin did affect all of creation. All of the world was affected by the sin of human beings. In this specific passage, though, we're talking about just the relationship between humans and God. Also, too, we understand that death entered the world through sin because every person now dies. It's a guarantee for all of us that we will someday have a memorial service, a funeral, with our name on it. It's going to happen. Each of us will die in this earthly form. Now, before the fall, before the original sin, before eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, there was no death. For the other tree that the humans could eat from, the other tree that Adam and Eve and all of Adam and Eve's descendants could eat from, is the tree of life. Thus, there was no aging, there was no sickness, there was no death, because you ate of the tree of life, thus your life was renewed, and so you stayed young and healthy for eternity. Well, once the sin happened, then they were separated from the garden, separated from the tree of life. Thus, age, decay, breakdown, illness, sickness, all of that started to come into reality because of the sin. The separation from God brings about death. Sin brings about death. And so these are realities. This is true about sin in this specific passage. we're going to be focusing on our relationship with God and not the relationship with the world, even though our sin does affect the world. It's like throwing a rock into a still pond. The ripples go out and affect the whole entire pond. Our sin affects the world. Our sin affects nature. Our sin affects everything in creation. And it's important for us to remember, just understand, kind of bracket it off for these few passages, because Paul is specifically focusing on our relationship with God. So let's take a look at verse 13. Verse 13, to be sure, sin was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not charged against anyone's account where there is no law. Okay, so we've got to unpack a very important question, and that is, was there sin before the law of Moses? It's a very good question, because when you think about Adam and Eve committed a sin. What was their sin? Right, they ate the forbidden fruit. Well, how did they know that they weren't supposed to eat the forbidden fruit? God told them not to eat the forbidden fruit, so they disobeyed God. So their sin was very clear because they disobeyed a command of God. They disobeyed a rule of God. They disobeyed the teaching of God. Well, when they committed that sin, they were banished from the garden. Thus, there was no one else that could ever get access to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Thus, that was taken off the table. And there was no other law given. Remember, the law doesn't come into play, excuse me, the law doesn't come into play until Moses. And Moses is many generations down the road. And so there's a long period of time from Adam and Eve to Moses where there is no law, there is no written rule from God saying this is what you do and this is what you don't do. And so there's no law to break. And so it leads us to that question to say, was there sin before the law of Moses? And that's a very important question. Again, Paul has been spending the first 4 chapters of Romans trying to get us to understand something very important about the law. And something very important about the law that he wants us to understand is that the law does not bring salvation. The law merely brings our sin to the forefront. The law merely brings us to a place where we realize we recognize our sin. We realize and we recognize our inability to overcome our sin. We realize and we recognize the inability to save ourselves. So the law's intention was never to save. The law's intention was to reveal our sin to us. So was there sin before the law? Yes. Sin has always existed. As long as there's human beings, there's sin. It's been there since Adam and Eve. Remember, Adam and Eve committed original sin, but there was something inside of them that gave them the desire to commit that sin. So that's something within our very nature. And we can spend a whole lot of time talking about the power of yes. The power of yes is only found in the ability to say no. The power of good is only found in the ability for there to be bad. You've got to have the point counterpoint. You've got to have both polar opposites because that gives choice. And power is found in choice. Love is found in choice. Compassion is found in choice. If there is no choice, there's no love, there's no compassion. If there is no choice, then there's no choice. You can only go one way. And so we understand that sin has always existed. For sin is anything that separates us from God. Sin is anything that causes us to miss the mark, or however else you want to define sin. It's always been there since the very beginning. The thing that we understand, though, is that specific sin was not counted against specific people before the law. So yes, there has been always lying, cheating, stealing. There has always been the desire to be God. There's always been the self-centered focus of being the center of the universe. That's always been a part of humanity. Those things just weren't specifically named sin because there was no law. So yes, sin has always existed, but specific sin was not counted against people before the law. So you couldn't look at somebody, if you lived between Adam and Eve and Moses, you couldn't look at somebody and say, you're breaking a commandment, because there was no commandment. You're breaking God's law, because there was no God's law. So sin was there. The law just didn't exist, so you couldn't pin a certain specific sin on a specific person. Again, bringing us back to that understanding that the law was never intended to save. The law was always intended to reveal our sinfulness to us. That was the purpose of the law. So when we look at this, we understand that it's a matter of perspective. The law turns ignorance into certain knowledge of our sin. That's the purpose of the law, was always the purpose of the law, has always been the purpose of the law, will always be the purpose of the law. The unfortunate reality is as human beings, we morph the law into something else. We morph the law into a way of being saved. We morph the law into a way of covering our you-know-what when it comes to our relationship with God. And that's not what it's for. It's for specifically to take us from ignorance into recognition and knowledge of our sin. It brings us to that place where we understand that we have sin. So yes, sin has always existed. But between Adam and Eve and Moses, you could not charge a specific sin towards a specific person because there was no law. So that's important for us to understand. Let's take a look at verse 14. Nevertheless, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking a command, as did Adam, who is a pattern of the one to come. So when we take a look at this, we understand that Adam's sin was different than everyone else until the law. Adam and Eve were the only two that ever broke a command of God. Their command was, you cannot eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Once they ate that fruit, they broke the command. That sin caused them to die. That sin caused them to be banished from the Garden of Eden. Well, once that banishment happened, nobody else had access to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Thus, there was no command, there was no law, there was no rule anymore that said you can't eat of that because no one could eat of that. And so we understand that Adam's sin was different because he broke a specific command. Now, other people sinned. There are other sins in the world after that. We know the story of Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve's sons, and how Cain murdered Abel because he was jealous of Abel's relationship with God, jealous of Abel's offering that was accepted and his wasn't. So we know that there is still sin existing, but at that moment we could not convict or we could not judge that person based on it because there was no law that said that was quote-unquote sin. Even though we know that murdering someone, regardless if there's a law or not, is not a good thing. But understand that Adam's sin was different than everyone else until the law because he broke a specific command. Once the law of Moses came into place, starting with the Ten Commandments, then there was now a specific command that we could break. There was a specific law that we could break that would reveal our sinfulness. And again, the purpose of the law is to reveal our sinfulness, not to save us, but to reveal our sinfulness. So sin is not counted against someone who does not break God's direct command. Sin is not counted against someone who does not break one of God's direct commands. So in essence, from Adam and Eve to Moses, there weren't sinners because there was no law for them to break. There was no command for them to break. There were behaviors that were acceptable, and there were behaviors that were liked. In fact, if we could go back in time and find ourselves living in the period of history between Adam and Eve and Moses, we would find that individual communities probably had rules. Individual communities probably had norms and mores. They probably had morals that they focused on. Now, that could be different community to community, but all communities, all gatherings of people who were together had developed some kind of rules. Now, something that was against the law or against the rules of this one community, if you go across over the other side of the hill to a new community, you might find that that's okay over there because they don't have a problem with it. But yet there were still rules because we understood that we were still sinful, but sin was not counted against someone who does not break God's direct command. Adam, his sin was counted against him because he broke a direct command. And because that sin was counted against him and he was the original, Adam and Eve were the original human beings, then it was like a snowball effect. That sin spilled out over us. And so we are all suffering the consequence of sin, even if we don't quote unquote sin ourselves because there's no law, even though we know that we sin anyways because we just are sinful beings. We need that salvation. We can't be good enough on our own. All who lived from Adam and Eve to Moses were not lawbreakers. They might have been sinners, but they weren't lawbreakers because there was no law to break. If there's no speed limit on the road, you cannot be pulled over and given a ticket for speeding. Now, you can go too fast around the corner and end up wrapping your car around a tree and dying. You can suffer the consequence of driving too fast. But you wouldn't be considered a lawbreaker because there was no law. And that's how humanity was living for all those generations between Adam and Eve and Moses. There was sin in the world, and there was consequence to that sin, death being one of them. There was sin in the world and the consequence of that sin, but there was no law breaking that was happening because there was no law at that point. And so it's important for us to understand this concept because Paul's going to be making a point here at the end of this verse that's going to be very important for us to grasp. But sin still existed. So in this time between Adam and Eve and Moses, people lied, they stole, they murdered, they committed adultery, and they did what was wrong. This happened. Why do we know this to be the case? Because they're human beings. Human beings, if left to our own devices, will have a tendency to go to the dark side, using a Star Wars reference. We have a tendency to lie and cheat and steal so that we can put ourselves at the center of the universe and we can get what we want. We make ourselves our very own God. Left to our own devices, we will end up doing that because, remember, we are created in God's image, thus we have just enough God in us to make us dangerous. And it's in that understanding that we need to submit. It's in that understanding that we need to surrender, to say, I can't do this on my own. I need your help. So we know that between Adam and Eve and Moses, sin still existed, because we could go back in that time and find that people would lie, steal, murder, commit adultery, and do what was wrong. That happened. And so we understand that. Because of their sin, they suffered the consequence, which is death. So there is not a single person that lived from Adam and Eve to Moses that overcame death because they had no sin in their life. They all had sin in their life. Why? Because they all died. And death is the consequence. It's the ultimate consequence of sin. There's other consequences of sin, financial ruin, relational ruin, things like that are consequences of sin. Lost friendships, things like that. But the ultimate consequence of sin is death. And we know that everyone from Adam and Eve to Moses died because there's none of them still walking around today. There's not somebody that's still walking around today that says, well, I never committed a sin, so I didn't die. That didn't happen. So we know that sin existed because they all died, because of the sin that they suffered. They suffered the consequence, which was death. And so we know that sin existed. Again, the proof is in the pudding. You want to find out what someone believes? Follow them around and watch what they do. If you want to know if sin existed between Adam and Eve and Moses when the law came and identified sin and made the right and wrong, the good and bad, the two lists, this is what you do, this is what you don't do kind of thing. If you go back in that time, people will die. Thus, the proof is in the pudding. There was sin in their life because the ultimate price that is paid, the consequence of sin, is death. So in this, we take a look and we understand that this, when it says that there's a pattern of the one to come, listen to these words again. Nevertheless, death reigned from time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking a command, as did Adam. Adam broke a specific command. So even though they did not break a specific command, there was still sin because people died, as did Adam. And it says, who is a pattern of the one to come. Do you have that in your translations? Who is a pattern of the one to come? Yeah, you most likely have something, either those words or something very similar to it. And so we have to understand that that is a reference to Jesus, as we talked about at the very beginning. Again, Jesus, not just a historical figure, but Jesus, the salvation for humanity. So is a pattern of the one to come equals Jesus had to become one of us in order to save all of us. In order for us to be saved, God had to come and dwell among us and be one of us. In order for us to be saved, God had to take on this form, had to live in this sin-stained world, and had to pay the ultimate price, had to die to pay the price for sin. Now, God could have, because God is God, God could have up in heaven said they're all saved, snapped his fingers, and it would have been done. But again, just like we understand that we need to have bad in order for good to be powerful, we need to have dark in order for light to be powerful, then we must understand that God just can't snap his fingers and make us saved. It's a decision that we must make. It's something that we have got to have a choice and say, I choose to believe this or I choose not to believe this. It can't be something that's just a blanket covering that it happens to you just like life. When you're born, you're saved because of the fact that God has saved you. It has to be a choice, for the power is found in the choice. So when we see this reference at the end that who is a pattern of the one to come, it's not saying that Jesus was a sinful man. It was saying that Jesus was in the pattern of Adam, meaning he was human. And Jesus had to be human. God had to come and dwell among us, not so that he could save us, but so that we could be saved. Jesus had to become one of us in order to save all of us. That's the only way that it can happen. And I want to end with a little example of why this is the only way it can happen. And it's the story of the kitten on Christmas Eve. There's a family that was getting ready for a Christmas Eve service. The father was not going. He was choosing to stay behind. He didn't go to church much. He went occasionally with them, but mostly it was the mom and the kids that would go. And so they were all getting ready, and Dad said he was going to stay home and he was going to get the house decorated and ready for Christmas. And so Mom got the kids all packed up in the car and gave Dad a kiss, and they left off for church. And as they were leaving off for church, it was starting to snow outside. It was Christmas Eve, after all, up north, and so the snow was starting to fall. And Dad was looking out the big picture window of the living room, and he was kind of enjoying the fact that it was starting to snow, because there's nothing better than a white Christmas. So he's getting things ready, he's sprucing up and decorating and getting presents ready and everything like that for Christmas. And all of a sudden he hears this sound, and it's the sound of a kitten on the front window, just pawing the window, because the kitten's cold and wants to come into the warmth. And so the dad sees the kitten, sees all the snow starting to fall, realizing that it's later on at night, and he says, well, if that kitten doesn't come in, then that kitten's not going to survive the night, because it's going to be a blizzard tonight. I saw the weather. And so he opens up the front door, and once he opens up the front door, the light from the living room comes out from behind him, shines out into the snow, scares the kitten jumps down off of the windowsill and runs into the bushes. And so the dad closes the door and goes back to doing what he was doing, because after all, the kitten ran away. And soon after, he hears the little tapping on the window again, and he looks back, and again he sees the kitten scratching on the window, because the kitten wants to get in, because the kitten wants to be saved. The kitten wants to be warm. The kitten wants to be spared this horrible death of freezing out in a Christmas Eve blizzard. And so the dad again opens up the front door. The light comes shining out from behind him. He starts to call for the kitten, and the kitten jumps down off the windowsill and runs into the bushes again. And now it's a little bit harder for the kitten to run into the bushes, because the snow is starting to accumulate on the grass a little bit. And so he just kind of throws up his hands in frustration, closes the front door again, and goes back in and continues to do whatever he's doing. Now he goes into another room and he does some other things, and it's been a little while, and he comes back out and he notices that the snow is even deeper now, and it's coming down even harder on this Christmas Eve. And he sees again the kitten at the front window, and the kitten's pawing on the window, because the kitten can see the warmth, the kitten can see the light, the kitten can see that if I want to be saved, I got to get in there. If I want to survive this blizzard, I've got to get in there. And so the kitten is trying to get in through the window. And so the dad is not really sure what to do, because he opened the front door twice and the kitten has run away. So he comes up with an idea, and this time he puts on his parka and he goes out through the garage and comes around the front of the house, thinking if he comes up behind the kitten, then he could get the kitten and bring it in and save it. And so as he's coming up behind the kitten, of course, he's got to walk through the snow. And the snow is deep now, so he's got to pick up his foot and crunk through the snow and crunk through the snow. And any of you have ever walked through snow before, you've heard the crackling of snow. So, well, the kitten hears him, turns, sees this huge parked man coming at him, and the kitten gets scared and jumps and goes boom, disappears in the snow, and then boom, pops up out of the snow, disappears again, pops up out of the snow, disappears again, and ends up going into the bushes again. And the dad is out in the front yard now. Snow is up to almost his knees. He's dressed in a parka. The blizzard's coming down. He's frustrated, and he just calls out, and he just says out loud, he says, the only way that this kitten will ever come to me is if I became a cat myself. And then as those words were coming out of his mouth, the church bell rang down in the valley, signifying that it was now Christmas morning. And at that moment was the first time that he truly understood. In order for us to truly understand, to acknowledge, and to embrace our salvation, we cannot deal with God because it's too scary. So God lowered himself and Jesus became the form of Adam, became the form of sinful humanity. Committed no sin, but became the form of sinful humanity, so that we would have a living, breathing example. One of us that we could relate to, that would lead us into the house and out of the blizzard, would lead us out of the cold into the warmth, would lead us from a life that was condemned to death through sin to a life that was saved by grace for eternity. And that's what it means when Paul says at the end, he says that who is a pattern of the one to come. For God knows that the only way that you and I will ever accept the salvation of Jesus is for God to come as one of us. For us to be saved, we can't have God just say we're saved. God had to come as one of us, so that we would have the decision, we'd have the choice, we'd have the freedom, we'd have the ability to be able to relate, to connect, and to be saved. And that's what he's talking about when he says that he was in the form of the one to come. For Jesus was not a sinner. Jesus was human, but he had no sin. And that's what made his death and resurrection so powerful. So that's where we're going to end today. We're going to end in verse 14. We'll pick up in verse 15 later. I thank you for tuning in. I pray that there's been a blessing in this study for you today. If there has been a blessing, please share this study with someone else. I'm sure there's someone else out there that you know that needs a little good news today. And I thank you in advance for sharing that. So until we get together again, I pray that you stay safe. I pray that you stay sane. And we'll see you soon.